Hey everyone. So I have some bad news and I have some good news for you. The bad news is if you haven't bought my latest book, System Wisdom, which is a great companion to this podcast because it expands on some of the concepts you hear about. Uh, Unfortunately, if you haven't bought it yet, the price has gone up. We had an introductory price, and now the book is a little bit more expensive than it was. But the good news is, if you're still interested in buying the book, for the next 2 weeks over the holidays until January 1st, 2020, uh, if you go to systemwisdom.co, that's .co, and you follow the link to purchase the book, when you check out, you have the option to type in a discount code. If you type in the discount code MPS, as in Methodically Processing Systems, you'll get 30% off your order. So there you go. It's a great way to support the show. And with that said, let's get on with the show, and I will see you all in the new year with some new episodes. Welcome to Methodically Processing Systems. I've always thought that people who cook on a regular basis tend to be wiser people than people who don't cook. I think that's because the act of cooking imparts some kind of wisdom directly to the person who is cooking. Somehow, through this process of turning raw ingredients into something wonderful, and of course sometimes not so wonderful, you gain an intuitive feel for the mechanisms of the world around you. You see, at a very abstract level, cooking is nothing more than a process of grappling with some very complex systems. And so that's what cooking gives to a person who is cooking. It's a real world education on dealing with complex systems. Now, one of the most important lessons that cooks learn and get, something that the rest of the people just never seem to quite understand, is the importance of scale. It's something that is essential to the process of cooking. You can't cook without understanding scale. But you can live in the world, you can learn, you can grow smart, and be completely ignorant of this little quality of our world. Things like size, weight, volume, quantity, duration. See, all these things are critical in the realm of cooking. And as it so happens, they are also critical to the rest of the world as well. Yet, somehow, for many unwise people, and I assume that these people are unwise because they've never cooked in their entire lives, this idea of scale is something you don't really think too hard about over the course of your day-to-day life. Now, because someone who doesn't cook doesn't think about it on a day-to-day basis, scale does not become a part of their day-to-day life. It doesn't infuse itself into one's soul. so you forget about it. You ignore it. Now, people's ignorance for this concept of scale happens in every domain you can imagine. In the United States in the 1930s, for example, we put together something called the Social Security System. Its intent was to keep Americans afloat in retirement. Now, when it was made, the United States had a population of around 120 something million people in it. Today, we have about triple that number. And that growth, as far as we can tell, is going to continue. Now, the problem, as you might have guessed, is that the system is not sustainable at a larger scale. It's barely sustainable today. So you had this otherwise very smart and intelligent people back in the 1930s, and it seems like they didn't give much, if any, thought to the time scale or the population scale of the problem that they were trying to solve. It would be like baking a cake and ignoring how many people you're baking for, or when they might arrive at your house to consume that cake. It's the kind of mistake that a person who cooks simply wouldn't make. And yet, someone who puts together a system to support millions of people in old age just happens to completely disregard this problem of scale. But let's be fair. The bigger things get, the more guilty all of us become of ignoring this factor of scale. So, naturally, things like politics and global relations and these sorts of topics tend to fall victim to our tendency to forget scale when things get big. And in some cases, forget scale, period. So what often ends up happening is that we take something that works well at one scale, generally a much smaller scale, and then we take it and try to force it into a much larger scale. We ignore time, we ignore quantity, we ignore size, and so on. Now, this all comes from a good place. We see problems on small scales, and we know how to solve them. So we try to take what we've learned at that small scale and try to do it at that much larger scale. Take something like farming. Farmers grow crops and raise animals that they and their local community can use for food and all kinds of things. And at that scale, farms are actually quite remarkable places. I think the word lovely might even apply. There are delicious crops, well taken care of animals, and the operations of these farms are inherently sustainable. It's the pinnacle of harmony between humankind and nature. Now, if you happen to visit one of these farms and you see this lovely place, you'll be tempted to say, "My God, farms are wonderful things, and we need to make sure that everyone on the planet can get the benefits of these farms all around the world." But you have to understand that a farm that serves a small local community, that lovely place that you're looking at, is not the same thing as a farm that might serve the entire world. If I told you to have a conversation with one person and a conversation with 1 million people, Your approach would be completely different based on the scale of the number of people that you are talking with. It's the same story with a farm. The only thing an industrial farm that serves the world has in common with a small local farm is the label farm. An industrial farm is generally unsustainable by simple virtue of scale. It relies on resources and equipment that cannot be provided through the regular operations of the farm itself. If you don't believe me, go to any farm and see if you can put together an industrial tractor. See if the farm can get the diesel fuel it needs to run the tractor, the oil that keeps the engine of the tractor running smoothly. A farm cannot sustain itself at an industrial scale. It needs resources from elsewhere. The need for those resources ends up increasing its costs. So the farm has to resort to less than pleasant practices to stay in the game at a global scale. That's how you end up with poor animals in frightful conditions. Farms do not scale up any more elegantly than trying to have a conversation with one person and then scaling up to having a conversation with 1,000,000 people. They grow more inhumane, and they have to, because otherwise they can't survive. They are not sustainable without less than stellar practices. They consume more resources. They wreak havoc on the local environment rather than exist in harmony with it. And the sheer scale of it means that sustainable practices are replaced with optimized ones, which result in damage to the local and the global environment. Now, I bring this example up because there is a class of well-meaning idiot out there right now, and these people are beckoning the world to eat less meat, and instead of eating this meat, they are beckoning the world to instead eat some more industrial scale plants so that we can save our planet. These are people who probably need to pick up some cooking as a hobby so that they can finally understand scale. The fact that you are eating a burger isn't destroying the world. It's the fact that your burger comes from halfway around the world, from land that can't inherently support industrial scale farming. The fact that the lettuce on your burger comes from the other half of the world, from a huge farm that has destroyed the local ecosystem. Plants, insects, animals died to grow millions of heads of lettuce so that you can have lettuce out of season. That's what's causing our planet to be damaged. The fact that you're eating a piece of meat isn't destroying the world. It's the fact that you're eating a piece of industrialized meat, and replacing that industrialized meat with another industrialized substance isn't going to solve anything. Our universe constrains various structures at different scales. So, there is a reason the blue whale is the largest animal on the planet. The structure of animals can only get so big before the whole thing becomes unsustainable. While we like to think that big things are strong, the reality is that the bigger things get, the weaker and more fragile they become. That's why there are so few large animals around. The bigger things get, the less efficient they become, the less adaptable, and the more reliant on external factors to survive. A great industrial farm that's so big that it can't feed its animals without reliance on outside feed will implode at the first disruption in its supply chain. Things at larger scales are simply under much, much more stress. And again, it's one of those things that a cook simply gets, but others sometimes miss. Imagine you're a cook. What sounds more stressful? If I asked you to make food for 4 people, or if I asked you to make food for 400 people? Which one could you do every day for the rest of your life? Which one would stretch your resources and your very physical being to the point of breaking? Which one would be sustainable? Which one would be unsustainable? If you want to be sustainable, whether it's environmentally or whether it's organizationally or whether it is in your daily life, you have to pay attention to the scale of things. Small and local will always be better than industrial, cheap bulk. Industrial, global scale farming of peas and parsnips would be just as destructive as industrial, global farming of cattle. And you can kind of test this for yourself by looking around and asking if the world around you is naturally filled with endless fields of peas and parsnips and millions of heads of lettuce on an immense industrial scale. And if the answer is no, which it usually is, you don't find fields of millions of heads of lettuce anywhere, then you fundamentally know that what you're looking at is not inherently sustainable. These huge industrial entities have to basically force the land to produce what they want. And that process is what makes it inherently unsustainable. Because the moment you let things go, everything is going to revert back to its natural state. And in both scales, whether it's local farming or industrial farming, there is human intervention required. But in one scale, the local farm, the sustainable local farm, that is happening at a very small scale, relatively speaking, the intervention is more akin to working with the land. It is a harmonious combination, a melding of humankind and nature. On the industrial scale, it's not a light touch. It's something more violent. It's not harmonious. It is forcing the land to produce something that it otherwise wouldn't. It's almost like you're fighting a war, right? You're bringing in equipment and machinery and outside supplies. There's logistics and supply chain. It's the same kinds of things that go into an invasion plan, right? You don't do that at a small local scale. You do that at the big industrial scale. At that industrial scale, you're not living off the land, you're using the land. You're extracting resources from it. And that is not sustainable. It all comes back down to scale. Large scale projects and initiatives suffer from problems of scale. The nature of things changes with scale. And again, if you cook, you know this. If you're pan frying or sauteing some vegetables, a small amount of vegetables cooks great, but a larger amount needs to be cooked up in batches. Otherwise, you end up with vegetables releasing more juices than can be evaporated in the pan, and so you end up boiling your vegetables instead. You need to use different techniques for different quantities. In our most vivid imagination and in our best theories, there are no limits to the scale of things. In the real world, that's not always the case. Why aren't there animals the size of Mount Everest? While on the other side of the scale, you have plenty of animals that are microscopic in their size. It's because large scale is not sustainable for animals on this planet. How do we know it's not sustainable? Well, we know that there used to be lots of big animals, and most of them have gone extinct every time there has been a large stressor or shock to this planet. Others have gradually faded away. And while we've got a few big animals remaining on land and in sea, they are almost all in danger of going extinct as well. Now, we could probably take all of our wonderful human ingenuity and one day force an animal into existence that is even larger than an elephant or a blue whale. But what would it take to keep that animal going? Not just to keep it going, not just to keep it surviving, but to keep it thriving. Can you imagine the resources that would be needed to keep its skeletal structure from collapsing under the weight of gravity, to help it get enough oxygen from the atmosphere to survive? We could no doubt do it for a time, but what we have to understand is that it would not be sustainable. Eventually, the constraints of physics, the constraints of chemistry, the constraints of the real world would bring the house of cards toppling in on itself. Now, if instead we took some time to cook up a few meals and bake a few cakes, we might start to learn to see the scale of the problems that we are trying to solve and the solutions that we are developing to solve them. As we wisen up to scale and as we notice the scale of things around us, we might even start to appreciate and understand that sometimes the best way to solve our problems isn't to think big and global, but instead to think small and local. Thank you so much for listening. If you enjoyed this show, please consider going to iTunes and leaving us a good review. It really helps. Thanks.